Weakness is not something we usually boast about. We live in a culture that praises strength, not weakness. In the second reading today, however, we are confronted with the opposite boast, not of strength, but of weakness. Let's look for a moment at Paul's second letter to the Corinthians and then ask, how might that be applied in my life today? As is often the case, the second reading in the liturgy of the Word is a continuous one. We read it for a number of weeks. We've been reading from Corinthians for 5 weeks, and today marks the last time we'll read from this letter for a while. Next week, we begin the letter to the Ephesians. 2 Corinthians is actually a collection of several letters that Paul sent to the church in the Greek city of Corinth. And the section that we read from today has to deal with Paul's qualifications as a teacher and apostle. Apparently, some other teachers or preachers had come to the town, and the people weren't quite sure who Paul was and what his qualifications were. In this passage, we hear Paul talking about the fact that he will only boast of his weaknesses, not his strengths. On the surface, this really flies in the face of common sense. You don't get people to believe in you by telling them what you cannot do. Suppose you were interviewing for a job and the employer said, "Tell me about yourself." And you start saying, "Well, I can't do this and I can't do that." I don't think you'd get the job. Paul's boast about his weakness, however, is connected with his wish to have the power of Christ work in and through him. He talks about the thorn in the flesh. Nobody really agrees on what that means, but it's some type of weakness that he had, and he uses that as a reminder that he's not always in control. He needs God's help. Moreover, when he realizes just how much he relies on God for his strength, it is precisely then that he's truly strong, able to get through difficult times. How do we apply this in our own lives? We too have to admit that we do not have ultimate control over situations. Moreover, I need to admit that there may be present in my own life moral weaknesses, this thorn in the flesh, actions which are not consistent with my calling to be Christian, and I need to invoke the power of Christ to overcome them. I mentioned before that the 12-step recovery programs adopt this basic insight into the process. The addict must first admit that he or she is powerless when it comes to the addiction, and then they must give themselves over to a higher power, and only then can recovery truly begin. It's very similar in our spiritual life as well. We might have to first admit that we are powerless to overcome certain moral weaknesses before we can allow the grace of God to heal us and make it possible to change. Today we need to name the weakness that is ours. Is it selfishness or impatience or holding grudges or lack of respect for myself or others? The list could go on and on. We need to admit to ourselves the presence of our own thorn in the flesh that serves as a reminder of our weakness, but more importantly, of the strength that can come and is possible from God. So today, let's imitate Paul and boast of our weaknesses, because, as Paul says, when we are weak, we are strong. When we let go and let God, we are on the road to recovery. For as Paul says, God's grace is sufficient for us.